They didn't scream at first. That's the part history doesn't tell you. 8 people sat at a Thanksgiving table, smiling, full, unaware that death had already entered their bodies quietly, patiently like a guest who knew exactly where to sit. Lean in. This is not a story they wanted remembered. On November 24, 1857, in Culleton County, South Carolina, a plantation house called Sweetwater Hall prepared for its annual ritual of gratitude. Polished silver, warm bread, glazed home. A family bound not by love, but by entitlement, inheritance, and the unspoken assumption that power lasts forever. And in the kitchen 40 feet away, but a world apart, stood a woman who had memorized their habits more precisely than scripture. Her name was Patience. Understand this, the most dangerous people in history are not the loud ones. They are the ones who watch, who listen, who wait, who learn your routines so well that you stop seeing them as human at all. For 30 years, Patience cooked their meals. She knew how much salt they tolerated, which dishes made them nostalgic, which ones made them careless. She knew which son drank too much, which daughter mocked without mercy, which man believed ownership gave him the right to erase bloodlines. She knew their secrets because power always confesses itself when it believes it is safe. The county records would later say, acute gastric fever. A neat phrase, clean, painless to write, but buried in the private notes of the attending physician was a sentence that should have detonated history. These symptoms did not resemble any illness known to medicine. That line was hidden for decades. Ask yourself why. Because what happened that night wasn't a tragedy. It was a violation of an unwritten rule. Slavery depended on a single psychological illusion, that the enslaved accepted their position as permanent. That resistance was impulsive, disorganized, emotional. That vengeance lacked intelligence. Sweetwater Hall shattered that illusion. This was not a sudden act. It was not rage. It was not madness. It was something far more unsettling to institutions built on dominance precision. Memory. Long-term intent. The kind of patience that terrifies empires because it cannot be rushed, bribed, or intimidated. By dawn, 8 members of the Rutledge family were dead, and the woman who fed them washed the dishes in silence. What you are about to hear is not just a story of poison. It is a lesson in how power blinds itself, how systems create the very force that eventually destroys them, and how the most effective resistance often looks like obedience until it is too late. Once you understand that, you will never look at history the same way again. Sweetwater Hall was not a grand plantation by Southern myth-making standards. That matters. Power is often most cruel where it feels most fragile. The Rutledge family was declining financially, socially, spiritually, and decline sharpens brutality. When a system senses its grip weakening, it tightens its fist on the nearest throat. Colonel Marcus Rutledge inherited land, not wisdom. The rice fields underperformed. Debts accumulated quietly, like mold behind the walls. His wife, Constance, carried the resentment of a woman who believed she had married beneath her destiny. Their children never truly left, not because they loved home, but because the world beyond Sweetwater had no use for them. This kind of household breeds a particular psychology. Entitlement without competence. Authority without respect. And when that happens, domination becomes the only language left. Patience was born into this environment. Not metaphorically, literally. Her first breath was taken on that land. Her first memories were of heat, smoke, and obedience. She learned to cook before she learned to read faces, and she learned to read faces before she learned to speak freely. By the age of 6, she understood something most adults never do. Survival depends on invisibility. The plantation ledger listed her as property. $700. That was her value on paper. But paper does not record what systems extract. It does not record the erosion of self, the theft of time, or the slow normalization of horror. It does not record the cost of watching children grow up knowing they can be taken at any moment. Patience watched that cost become real. On March 7, 1846, while she stood at the stove preparing dinner, her 10-year-old daughter Grace was sold. No warning. No goodwill. A transaction executed with the same casual efficiency as selling livestock. The sound that followed Grace screaming from the yard was not noted in any record, but it carved something permanent into Patience. Here is where most people misunderstand revenge. They imagine it as explosive, emotional, immediate, but in environments of total control, rage is a luxury. Survival requires delay. Intelligence requires restraint. Marcus Rutledge Jr. sold the child to pay a gambling debt. $200. When Patience begged for information, he struck her and reminded her of the rule that sustained the entire system. Your children are not yours. And when the colonel learned of it, his outrage was not moral. It was procedural. The price could have been higher. That moment did something irreversible. It taught Patience that there was no internal correction mechanism in this world. No justice to appeal to. No authority above the authority that already owned her. From that day forward, obedience became camouflage. Silence became study. And memory became a weapon that would not rust. What grew inside her was not hatred. It was clarity. Clarity changes how a man or a woman moves through the world. After that day, Patience stopped reacting and started observing with intention. This is the phase most power structures never see coming. They are trained to detect rebellion, not comprehension. She learned the plantation the way a general learns terrain. Not just paths and buildings, but habits, timing, complacency. She noticed how authority breeds predictability. The Rutledges believed control was permanent, so they never varied their routines. Thanksgiving was always the same. The seating, the dishes, the hour the brandy came out. Ritual to them meant tradition. To Patience, it meant opportunity. There was another education happening beyond the eyes of the house. In the margins, in the spaces the overseers ignored. Men and women who carried knowledge older than the institution enslaving them. Knowledge that did not ask permission to exist. Old Isaiah worked the stables. To the Rutledges, he was useful muscle slowly wearing out. To those who knew how to listen, he was a living archive. Before chains, before ledgers, before names were erased, he had been a root doctor. A man who understood that the land gives and the land takes, depending on who knows how to ask. Patience listened. This is where suppressed history becomes uncomfortable. Enslaved people were not ignorant of chemistry. They were not strangers to pharmacology. They were forced into intimacy with it. Cooking, healing, cleaning, these were chemical systems long before laboratories gave them Latin names. Isaiah taught her which plants healed and which destroyed. Oleander, ornamental and lethal, planted to impress visitors. Pokeweed, common and deceptive. Water hemlock, the most dangerous of all, capable of mimicking illness so convincingly that even trained physicians would mistake it for disease. More important than the substances was the logic. Dosage, delay, distribution, symptoms that created confusion rather than certainty. Knowledge that could pass through a kitchen without leaving fingerprints. Isaiah never asked her what she planned to do. That silence was deliberate. In environments of surveillance, explicit intent is a liability. But before he died, he left her with a sentence that should unsettle you. If you want suffering, give a little at a time. If you want truth, give everything at once. That was not advice. It was strategy. Understand what this means. For 11 years after her child was sold, Patience fed the people who destroyed her life. She smiled when required. She lowered her eyes. She became the perfect servant because perfection is disarming. It teaches power to stop paying attention. And while they forgot her humanity, she memorized their mortality. This is the part institutions never admit. Domination creates experts in collapse. Thanksgiving was not chosen for sentiment. It was chosen for certainty. Rituals expose systems. They reveal who must be present, who must perform, and who will not question what is placed before them. Sweetwater Hall's Thanksgiving dinner was mandatory attendance. No excuses. No absences. Every hierarchy locked into position around a single table. That table was the nerve center of the Rutledge family's power. And power, when centralized, becomes fragile. The year was 1857. The house was aging. The family was bitter. And Patience had been invisible for so long that her presence had become background noise. That is when systems are most vulnerable, when they confuse silence for submission. She began long before dawn. Not hurried. Not frantic. Precision has a calm to it that panic never understands. The turkey browned perfectly. The ham glistened under its glaze. The pies cooled exactly as they always had. Familiarity was the disguise. Nothing new invites suspicion. Nothing perfect raises alarms. Into the brown sugar glaze went the powder. Finely ground. Measured. Enough to kill, not enough to reveal itself immediately. This was not an attack meant to be interrupted. It was a conclusion meant to unfold. 8 plates received the same care. 1 did not. Even vengeance respects boundaries. Innocents were excluded. Collateral damage is the language of tyrants, not the oppressed who have learned discipline. As the family gathered, they performed gratitude without reflection. They thanked God for abundance stolen from others. They laughed. They criticized. They consumed. Colonel Rutledge praised the meal. His wife commented on balance and flavor. Marcus Jr. went back for more. Understand this moment. The people who believed themselves untouchable were praising the hand that was ending them. That is not irony. That is exposure. When the first cramps began, no one suspected intention. That is the brilliance of systems built on denial. They cannot imagine consequence as design. Only accident. Only misfortune. Before I continue, you need to participate. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see the pattern. Write it again. I see the pattern. Not for me, for you. To mark the moment you stop consuming history and start reading it. Because what followed was not chaos. It was revelation. As bodies convulsed upstairs, Patience waited. Not with guilt. Not with fear. With stillness. She had already accepted the cost. She had paid it for 11 years. The question history avoids is not whether she was justified. The question is why systems like this always believe the kitchen is safe. The physician arrived believing in illness. That belief shaped everything that followed. Dr. Silas Beaumont had spent 30 years treating fevers, fluxes, and seasonal sickness. He trusted patterns, and that trust blinded him. What he saw did not fit. 8 bodies, identical symptoms, violent vomiting, cramping so severe it bent spines backward, sweating that soaked sheets, muscle failure advancing too fast, too uniformly, too deliberately. Disease does not move with that kind of discipline. Beaumont tried everything his training allowed. Induced purging, charcoal, laudanum, remedies meant to calm the body. None of it mattered, because the problem was not imbalance. It was intrusion. One by one, the Rutledge family collapsed into seizures. Not the weak tremors of illness, but convulsions powerful enough to fracture bone. Neighbors later described the sounds from Sweetwater Hall as animalistic. That detail is important. When dominance collapses, it strips people of the dignity they assumed was inherent. Marcus Rutledge Jr. died slowly. The same man who sold a child for gambling money fought for breath like someone drowning on dry land. His face locked into an expression witnesses could not forget. Pain has a way of rewriting authority. The colonel lasted until near dawn. His final question, recorded quietly, then buried, was not a prayer. It was not repentance. It was confusion. Who did this to us? That question haunted the county. Because no one wanted the answer. The official record named fever. The community accepted it. They needed to. If the truth emerged, It would expose something far more dangerous than murder: competence among the enslaved. Strategy, long memory, the ability to wait decades and strike without leaving evidence that fit the narrative. Patience was questioned briefly, observed casually, dismissed completely. She had been too perfect for too long to suddenly become suspect. That is the flaw in every control system. It rewards obedience so consistently that it forgets obedience can be learned, performed, and weaponized. Within weeks, Sweetwater Hall was abandoned. The land sold, the story diluted. By the time whispers began circulating, they were framed as superstition. Poison was too intentional, too unsettling. So the truth was pressed down, not erased, suppressed, hidden in letters, in marginal notes, in conversations that ended abruptly when the wrong ears entered the room. Patience disappeared from records soon after. No trial, no punishment, no acknowledgement. And that silence is the loudest evidence of all. Because when institutions truly believe they are innocent, they investigate. When they know they are exposed, they bury. This was not just the death of a family. It was a rupture in the mythology of control. After Sweetwater Hall went quiet, the machinery of silence activated. This is how power protects itself, not with truth, but with omission. No inquest worth the name. No questions that led anywhere dangerous. The deaths were folded into the long catalog of antebellum misfortune, where heat, illness, and bad luck explained everything that threatened the social order. But men like Dr. Beaumont knew better. His private correspondence tells a different story. Doubt written in careful language. Observations he never spoke aloud. Because to name poison was to name agency. And to name agency was to admit a crack in the foundation of ownership. This is how institutional manipulation works. It does not always lie. Often, it simply decides what will not be discussed. Consider the psychology of the county officials. If the truth surfaced, it would mean acknowledging that the enslaved were capable of long-term planning, chemical knowledge, restraint, and execution under pressure. That would collapse the justification for domination, which depended on portraying them as childlike, impulsive, and incapable of self-governance. So the story had to be neutralized. In the years that followed, local historians avoided the case. Clergy referenced it obliquely, framing it as a moral warning about decadence rather than cruelty. The plantation economy moved on, pretending the incident was an anomaly rather than a consequence. This is the deeper lesson. Systems do not fear violence. They fear comprehension. Violence can be punished. Comprehension spreads. Patience was never captured because there was nothing to capture. No confession. No evidence that fit the rules. She did not rebel loudly. She complied perfectly until compliance itself became lethal. Ask yourself why her name took nearly 40 years to surface in whispered accounts. Because speaking it changed the story. It transformed the Rutledges from victims into participants in their own destruction. It reframed the event from tragedy to response. And that reframing is intolerable to power. What happened at Sweetwater Hall reveals a suppressed truth about psychological control systems. They rely on underestimating the very people they dominate. They train themselves to look for overt defiance and miss the disciplined mind preparing in silence. This pattern did not end with slavery. It repeats wherever institutions reduce humans to functions, where labor is extracted without dignity, where obedience is mistaken for loyalty. Once you see this, you begin to recognize it everywhere. The poison was not the most dangerous element in that house. The most dangerous element was patience. Here is where the story stops being about 1857 and starts being about you. Sweetwater Hall is gone, but the architecture of control it represented is not. It simply learned to dress better, to speak softer, to replace chains with contracts, ledgers with algorithms, overseers with incentives. The mechanism is the same. Extract labor, suppress awareness, and convince the controlled that resistance is either impossible or immoral. Patience understood something most people never articulate. Power is lazy. Once it believes itself permanent, it stops guarding its blind spots. It assumes compliance is consent, confuses silence with agreement. That assumption is always fatal eventually. Think about why this story feels dangerous. It is not because 8 people died. History is saturated with death. It is dangerous because it violates the narrative you were taught about where intelligence lives, about who plans and who reacts, about who is allowed to be strategic. The Rutledges believed knowledge flowed in one direction, from master to servant, from owner to owned. They never imagined the kitchen as a site of analysis, never imagined memory as a form of power, never imagined that the person they erased every day was studying them with the precision of a tactician. That miscalculation is universal. Institutions still rely on it. Corporations assume employees won't notice patterns. Governments assume populations won't connect dots. Elites assume distraction equals ignorance. And for long periods they are correct. Until they are not. What Patience executed was not vengeance driven by emotion. It was consequence delivered by structure. She did not lash out. She concluded a process. And that distinction matters more than morality debates ever will. Men who are drawn to stories like this are not seeking gore. They are seeking leverage, understanding, a map of how systems actually fail, not through frontal assault but through internal contradiction. Sweetwater Hall fell because it violated a basic law of dominance. Never forget the humanity of those beneath you. The moment you do, you stop seeing threat where it is most likely to emerge. This is why the story was buried. Not to protect the dead, but to protect the living system that replaced it. Because if people begin to understand that patience, discipline, and knowledge can outlast brute force, control becomes expensive to maintain. And expensive systems eventually collapse. The question this story leaves you with is not whether patience was right. The question is what blind spots exist in the systems you live under now and who is quietly learning them. There is a reason stories like this surface only in fragments. A letter here, a note there, a whisper passed down and softened with time. Complete truths are destabilizing. They rearrange how a man understands power, obedience, and his own position in the hierarchy. Patience was never memorialized. No marker. No recorded last words. History prefers villains it can punish and heroes it can parade. She was neither. She was an outcome. The logical conclusion of a system that believed domination could exist without consequence. That is the final revelation. Sweetwater Hall did not fall because of poison. It fell because it violated the most dangerous law in human history. People remember. Memory accumulates. And when memory is paired with opportunity, it becomes irreversible. The enslavers believed time was on their side. That suffering dulls awareness. That generations of control erased the will to act. They were wrong. Time sharpened the blade. Silence honed it. Routine concealed it. This is why the story matters now. Not as spectacle, as instruction. Every system that depends on psychological submission carries within it the seed of its own undoing. The longer it lasts, the more data it feeds to those it underestimates. Habits, weaknesses, predictable rituals, points of leverage invisible to those who benefit from them. You live inside such systems today. They are quieter, more sophisticated, but they rely on the same assumption Sweetwater Hall relied on. That awareness will never fully form. The moment you see the pattern, you are no longer harmless. That is why this knowledge feels heavy. It is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to recalibrate you, to pull you out of passive consumption and into strategic observation. Remember how this began. 8 people sat down to eat, believing the world would continue as it always had. They were wrong, and the force that ended them did not announce itself. It served the meal flawlessly. Dangerous knowledge does not shout. It waits. If the story unsettled you, it should have. Because once you understand how power actually collapses not through noise, but through precision, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you cannot unknow your own position within it. History did not record patience as powerful. History rarely recognizes the moment power changes hands, but it always remembers the silence right before it does.